Great, so we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Daniel Castro. I'm a senior analyst here at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, or ITIF. For those of you that don't know ITIF, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy think tank. We do a lot of work on different policy issues related to IT and innovation. Our discussion today is going to be on the book, Viral Hate, Containing Its Spread on the Internet, by Abraham Foxman and his co-author, Christopher Wolf, who is here with us today. So, like many Americans, I've encountered hate speech online. In my experience, it's not the defining characteristic of the internet, but certainly something that I think everyone comes across. And I think you come across it much more in your online life than in your offline one. And I think there's certainly, we can agree that there's more bigotry and cyberbullying and other types of malicious speech online than in general we would want. But I do think it's a positive sign that many groups are taking action. Just last month, a number of activists drew high-profile attention to Facebook because of some particularly disturbing misogynistic content that was posted by users on the site. And to its credit, Facebook, I think, took fairly swift action. They already had anti-hate speech policies, but they responded. They revised their policies and procedures. They engaged with the community, and they really, I think, responded to the criticism that was leveled at them. So I think there is a lot of ongoing discussion, and I think there's a lot of people who are being proactive in this area, but it's certainly an issue that I think deserves more attention. And because of that, Chris, I mean, I really applaud what you've done with this book, because I think you've not only provided a really accessible primer to this important issue and all the many different implications, but I think you also offer a very even-handed treatment of many of the diverse policy options that are available. And that's something that I'm really looking forward to engaging in discussion with you and the other panelists today. What I've asked Chris to do to start us off is to spend about 15 to 20 minutes giving a little bit of an overview about the book. And then our panelists are going to respond and provide their perspective on his presentation. We are going to save plenty of time for a little bit of back and forth between the panelists, as well as lots of time for questions. We are live streaming this. If you'd like to ask questions via Twitter, you're welcome to do that as well if you're live streaming or even if you're in the room, but we'll also allow any questions in the room. So let me, hashtag ITIF. Thank you. So the full bios of our panelists are online, but let me just briefly introduce everyone. First we'll be hearing from the co-author, Chris Wolf. Chris has practiced law for more than 3 decades and currently leads the global privacy practice at Hogan Lovells. He's also the founder and co-chair of the Future Privacy Forum, and earlier this year formed the Coalition for Privacy and Free Trade. Chris has edited or authored several books on privacy and internet issues. He was honored as one of Washington, D.C.'s Tech Titans by Washingtonian Magazine very recently in the May edition this year. His work on the issue of internet hate speech is an outgrowth of his volunteer participation in the mission of the Anti-Defamation League. Chris currently chairs the ADL's National Civil Rights Committee, and he founded the ADL's Internet Task Force in 1995. He is chair of the International Network Against Cyber Hate, and is also the co-chair of the Task Force on Internet Hate of the Interparliamentary Coalition for Combating Anti-Semitism. Next, we'll be hearing from Leslie Harris. Leslie is the president and CEO of the Center for Democracy and Technology. Leslie is also a widely recognized expert in her work on policy issues related to civil liberties, new technologies and the internet, including free expression, consumer privacy, cybersecurity, internet governance, and global internet freedom. She was twice named one of Washington, D.C.'s Tech Titans by Washington Magazine. So she's also been selected as Fast Company's most influential women in tech and HuffPost's 10 female tech CEOs to watch. And then last, Adam Thayer is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University with the Technology Policy Program. His primary research interests are technology, media, the internet, and free speech policy issues, with a particular focus on online child safety issues and online privacy issues. Adam has spent almost 2 decades in the public policy research community. He previously served as president of the Progress and Freedom Foundation, director of the Telecommunications Studies at the Cato Institute. He's a senior fellow at Heritage Foundation and a researcher at the Adam Smith Institute in London. I've been told not to call him conservative. So, not at all. With that, Chris, I'd like to invite you up. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Daniel. I'm especially happy to be here with Leslie and Adam, who I'm happy to intersect with in lots of different contexts, and especially in the area of combating hate speech. Leslie is on one of the task force you mentioned. And Adam invited me to do a chapter in your book, The Next Digital Decade. So we've been around the block on this issue quite a lot, and I'm interested to hear their comments and reactions to the book. So when I talk about the book, which of course is for sale in the back of the room, and for those of you online, it's for sale at Amazon or Barnes & Noble or wherever you'd like to buy it. And I'm happy to sign it if you bought copies here. But when I talk about it, I actually start by talking about the old schoolyard adage, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words may never hurt me. If that was ever true, it's not true today. Tell that to the Holocaust Museum guard and his family, the guard who was murdered by a neo-Nazi whose evil, violent delusions were kept alive in his online community, who at age 88 hosted his own white supremacist website. Tell that to the women who live in fear of being raped because of misogynistic online threats and other contents celebrating attacks on women. Tell that to the cyberbullied kids who stay home from school because they're so terrorized by the things that happen to them in their own room, in front of their own screen. And tell that to Tyler Clementi, the Rutgers student who committed suicide because of a tweet that ridiculed him for being gay after his roommate spied on him with a computer camera. So the whole sticks and stones saying is simply not true in the world of websites, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. And in fact, in the online world, words and pictures and videos and online games are infecting the world with a virus of hate that is a threat to people and to society. They'll say it as bluntly as that. And Abe Foxman and I wrote Viral Hate Containing Its Spread on the Internet because hate-filled, demeaning, degrading, and potentially violence-inspiring content are not necessarily the byproduct of free expression. We believe freedom of expression, as important as it is, and it is, but it doesn't trump human dignity. So we wrote the book because we believe people should not sit idly by when we see online attacks on people because they are different. The Anti-Defamation League is a 100-year-old institution where Abe Foxman, my co-author, is the national director and where I chair the National Civil Rights Committee, has been mentioned. And our mission is to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to promote justice and fair treatment for all. And as part of that mission, the ADL has worked for years on this epidemic of online hate. And in fact, our work goes back to something that we wrote in 1986 called Bulletin Boards of Hate, even before the internet became the distribution channel. While certain aspects of internet hate have certainly received a lot of attention, and I think of cyberbullying, the problem actually, until recently, has not been high in the national and international consciousness, and that's one of the reasons we wrote the book too. And we wrote about these issues and we care about them, not just because we are civil rights activists. Abe works on civil rights issues full-time and I do it whenever I can, but we've seen the effect of attacks, physical and verbal, on minorities. And we wrote about it because we care about it, but also this is personal. Abe is a Holocaust survivor whose parents entrusted him to his Catholic nanny when he was an infant, and he was baptized and grew up with her caring for him. And he, is from the time and place where propaganda was the accomplice to the death of millions. As he puts it, the Holocaust didn't begin with the ovens, it began with words, words of hate, words of intolerance. And at the fourth Global Forum on Anti-Semitism in Jerusalem at the end of May, Abe and I were there together, and we both explained that the virus of internet hate is spreading every day in ways that Hitler and his propaganda experts never could have envisioned, certainly. Abe has been a towering figure in the fight against anti-Semitism for a decade, and so his involvement in fighting online hate is a natural. I do kid him a little bit about his technology adoption. He still refers to his mobile device as a BlueBerry, but that's another issue. And for me, it's personal too. I'm an openly gay man, married, and now that marriage will be recognized by the federal government, I'm happy to say. But growing up, I endured the epithets and degrading comments that were widely socially acceptable. So this is a personal issue for me, both as a gay man and as someone who's Jewish. Hate speech on the internet, though, covers more than anti-Semitism and homophobia, and as we explain in the book, It's become an organizing and communications tool for extremists on the left and on the right. And before the internet, these people literally met down dark alleys or in basements and distributed their materials in plain brown wrappers. And now with the push of a button, they can distribute their materials and spread their lies of hatred worldwide. Sociologists that we quote in the book have concluded that online hate gives some people a sense that violence is not only possible for some people to commit, but it's laboratory. Online communities of extremists and the proliferation of hate says to them, you're not crazy, you're right, go do it. And at the other end of the spectrum, but also disturbing, are the anti-Semitic, racist, homophobic, and other hate-filled rants that one sees in the comments section to mainstream news sites. We've all seen those, and often they're posted anonymously. By the way, my red light is blinking. I don't know whether that means my microphone is working or not.
Maybe we should switch our mics.
Okay. Thank you. Great, thanks very much. So you remember during the Newhoff affair, there were stories in the Palm Beach Post appended to which were comments that were so virulently anti-Semitic, making kind of the stereotypical comments about money and Jews and world power. The Palm Beach Post just cut off the comments. And for a lot of people, that kind of hate speech is simply online pollution that we have to tolerate the way we would trash on the street. But its common and ubiquitous appearance gives some the impression that those opinions that are expressed are mainstream and acceptable. And we're especially worried about the impact of that kind of thing on vulnerable children. From what we call cloaked websites, such as the one that purports to be a tribute to Dr. Martin Luther King, but actually if you click through the homepage, is a racist site containing racist lies. There are also online games that celebrate attacks on immigrants and other minorities, and of course, cyberbullying. So kids are a special concern of ours, and we talk about that in the book, and we say that vulnerable children believe what they read and can be misled or worse. And they have to be, in the words of the South Pacific song, carefully taught to hate. And the internet is become an education for kids who might become haters. And it's also disturbing that many people react to online hate by not reacting and by considering it as the norm. And so while we spend some of the time in the book talking about how bad things are on the internet, we do try to explain how each of us can stand up against internet hate, and we put an action plan in the book. We don't want it simply to be a dire report. We want it to inspire people. But what we don't advocate, and I think this is a really critical point, and I suspect we're going to have a lot of discussion about this, what we don't advocate is the use of the law to regulate speech. And it's not just because the First Amendment in the United States puts strict limitations on the regulation of speech, but we have found, and as Daniel pointed out, I've been studying this issue since 1995, even where laws are available to control speech, they are largely ineffective and often counterproductive. You know, we understand how in places like Germany, I'm speaking at a conference on Holocaust denial online in Berlin week after next, and I understand how it's literally unspeakable to deny the Holocaust that resulted in the murder of millions. And that laws can be symbolic. They can make an important statement, as Holocaust denial laws do. But as a tool to make a difference in the appearance of hate speech, our findings are that they really don't make much of a difference. And in fact, as we explain in the book, enforcement of those laws is a little bit like trying to deal with a cockroach problem in your house by killing one on the counter and ignoring all the ones behind the wall that are waiting to come out. We also find that when individuals are prosecuted for hate speech, their followers tend to then republish their works with great enthusiasm, and that the individuals become martyrs. Then there's the issue of scale. You know, every minute on the internet, and these statistics are probably stale as to scale right now, but there are 550 new websites, 300,000 tweets, 42,000 Facebook shares, and 600 hours of YouTube video added every minute. So the scale is really overwhelming, and you can't imagine any law enforcement being effective enough to deal with that torrent of information. The British police recently stepped up arresting isolated individuals who made anti-Muslim statements under the UK's so-called malicious communications law. And while we're against anti-Muslim statements, all that effort will do is deal with just a small handful of comments, and it may, in fact, chill legitimate dissent while driving haters to other outlets where they might be less identifiable. Critical retweets that I'll mention in a moment may be more effective. And while UK's use of the law may be only episodic and may be objectionable episodically, there are repressive regimes around the world like China and Iran and Russia that take comfort and justification from the use of laws in democracies to regulate online speech. So you may be asking by now, if the law is not an available tool, what is the way to proceed? And again, it's not by shrugging off online hate as the inevitable effluent. It is addressing the problem of scale. But when viruses cause disease in society, we don't say, look, this is just so large a problem that we're not going to begin to address it. Likewise, the virus of hate, we think, requires a broad response. We have to get started somewhere. And so we talk in the book about counter speech, the disinfectant of sunlight, as Justice Brandeis put it, and we think it's a powerful tool. Daniel mentioned the episode during the last week of May in which that coalition of women's group spoke up against Facebook, but also against Facebook's advertisers. They got them where it hurt. And Nissan and perhaps others pulled ads because of Facebook's policy not to police more vigilantly the misogynistic content. And again, Facebook stepped up to the line, and they're a great partner of the ADLs in fighting online hate, so I don't want to cast them in a too negative a light. They recognize they needed to do better, and I think they are. There was an event on Facebook called Kill a Jew Day, and Facebook took that down. But while it was still up, there were multiple groups called 1 Million Strong Against Kill a Jew Day. So counter speech worked as well as the actions of the intermediaries. And look at the people speaking up on Twitter by retweeting the rants of other people. There was a Washington Post article recently that said, you know, some of the people who are retweeting are scolds and do it too often, but that may be. But it also is a very effective way to call out people for saying things that we simply shouldn't accept in a civilized society. But we think there's also a role for the intermediaries. At a minimum, the hosts of online content, web hosts, social media companies should have clear terms of service prohibiting hate speech, that they should have the staff and procedures in place to enforce. Obviously, care needs to be taken to allow free expression, but there is content that I think everyone can agree crosses a line. When that happens, it ought to come down under the terms of service. There's another reason they ought to do it, because state attorney generals now are proposing for the first time in a long time that perhaps Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which allowed the Facebooks, YouTubes, and Googles of the world to exist, to be created, that perhaps the immunity provided to those services for the content of users ought to be re-examined. I don't think it should be, and I said so to the attorneys general last week when I spoke to them. But self-regulation, co-regulation with interested parties like the group that Leslie and I are involved with, could go a long way to fending off that kind of call to limit Section 230. And this is not a First Amendment issue. The government's not involved here. We're talking about the hosts exercising their own First Amendment rights to publish what they choose. And if they want a more civil corner of the internet, as we hope they do, and recognize that it will help their business, that's their right. And so we've worked with Google and Facebook. We have a group that includes Microsoft and Twitter and others. The discussion is continuing. We think a large degree of transparency is necessary about the decisions that are made. Jeff Rosen has written a lot about this issue. He wrote The Decider, which is a cover story on the New York Times Magazine a while back when Nicole Wong, who's now in the White House, was the person at Google making the major decisions. And he wrote recently in the New Republic on the issue. He takes a more cramped view of what the role of the intermediaries can be, and we can discuss that, but I think they do have a role, and we talk about that in the book. There's a lot of education that needs to go on. Companies like Facebook need to understand why Holocaust denial, for example, is anti-Semitic hate speech. They now permit it. We think they shouldn't. They also can promote counter speech. We went to Google when, a couple years ago, if you put the search term Jew in a search engine, one of the first sites that came up as a result was Jew Watch, which is a virulently anti-Semitic site. And we said, can't you do something about that? And they said, no. our search results are our search results. And the solution we came up with was a free sponsored link right alongside that search result that said, this is hate speech. You want to learn about hate speech? You want to learn about anti-Semitism? Click here, go to the ADL. We thought that was creative. We have a similar arrangement on YouTube. In addition to counter speech, and in addition to the role of the intermediaries, we think more needs to be done to teach kids about hate online, and frankly, more needs to be done in the area of cyber literacy, period. It was cute for a while for parents to say, we're cyber immigrants and kids are cyber natives, and we really don't understand this stuff. It reminded me of the time when my dad used to put black electric tape over the clock on the VCR because it kept flashing 12, 12, 12, and he couldn't figure out how to set it. And that's a call-out today. We used to give advice to parents, put the family computer at the corner of the kitchen and watch your kids when they're online. Think how quaint that sounds, and that was about a decade ago. And with mobile screens and kids getting access to the internet in so many different ways, we need a more coherent and comprehensive cyber literacy education program in this country. And then finally, I think all of us have a responsibility to speak up when we see online hate speech and don't simply slough it off. The saying, when you see something, say something, shouldn't be restricted to backpacks and airports. We really should exercise our free speech rights to point out when there's content, when there are even comments on news stories. So we have a duty. And I think otherwise, Edmund Burke's warning from the pre-internet era still applies, because the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. So thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today, and I look forward to the responses from the other panelists and to our discussion.
Are you sending us up
You
there?
can stay there and show that one.
I shall stay where I am.
So I just have a few brief opening remarks. I mean, I thought the book offered an accessible and in some ways spot-on exposition and critique of hate speech laws. It's hard to take issue with the practical kinds of recommendations that exist in the book. But I've got a few worries and a couple of actual concerns, and we should put on the table. First, I do worry about this characterization of the internet as hate-filled. And I know that Chris, in fact, believes, as I do, that the internet has been an extraordinary resource and provided opportunities for democracy building and for communities to be created around the world that are positive and build our civic institutions and build our rights. And I do worry that there's sort of a one-sided view and that others are likely to use this book as an example of many things, including the need to police, from a government perspective, the internet more aggressively. But my first real big worry is that the book is uniquely American, and I think it's written for an American audience. And as millions of new internet users are gaining access in the global south, I'm not sure these solutions are going to hold for very long. Users are going to be increasingly less familiar with concepts like user empowerment as an answer to unpopular speech. And to the extent that they embrace the notion of counter speech or companies being involved in the solution, I don't think their notions of hate speech are going to line up very neatly with ours. And I think that the reader of the book may not understand what an outlier the United States is when it comes to hate speech, and that the laws that are cited in other countries are not just that those countries have come up with a different view. It's that basically our foundational human rights instruments insist as much in the removal of that kind of speech as they do in the protection of First Amendment. There's a tension that's recognized elsewhere that we have sort of drawn a different line on. And very often that's not about the question of whether or not speech leads to violence, which is the U.S. sort of incitement standard. It's really about whether it undermines equality. And we can agree or disagree with that, but in a global medium where we are the outlier, asking companies to sort of stand in for the government, I think it's going to become increasingly difficult. And I'm not advocating necessarily for a different position. I'm just saying that, the fortress America, the America of I keep my servers in California, I think it's going to be a really hard line to draw in terms of, and honestly, I think in the last couple of weeks, with the NSA revelations, I think this idea of U.S. cloud services located in the United States, immunized from the laws in many other countries, is going to be very, very difficult to maintain, and that we've already had concerns about local server requirements around privacy on the commercial side. We don't want these companies to have our information so they can advertise to us. I think the NSA revelations may have just turned this book on its head, because I just think suddenly the protective shield of these companies being located in an environment where they can pick and choose decisions about what's hate speech and what's not is something that, you're writing about what's going to happen in the next 10 years. I think that's going to be a seminal fight, and it's going to make a big difference here. I'm also a bit concerned, given that, but also the fact that Americans in U.S. law, we're going to be sort of the minority here, that, providing opportunities for counter speech, taking down bad speech, agree with it. But I think that we are walking in some ways to a buzzsaw that we have to understand we're walking into, and that's, why put up a free ad for anti-Semitic speech? You will have pleaders, good and bad, drawing lines in very different places, and I can imagine Google that things that we would consider sort of part of acceptable debate, if not mainstream, and I certainly don't want to limit what's acceptable to mainstream, is very, very different from other very well-developed countries. So I think that making this happen in reality is going to be, I think, difficult. And, I think we've already... I also worry about the idea that, don't worry, we're not going to touch our Constitution or try to change it. We're simply going to shift all that responsibility to companies. And Rebecca McKinnon has written, I think, eloquently. I'm doing this so Adam can go crazy about this concept of whether or not we now have sovereigns in cyberspace. So I worry also that, okay, we don't take this on as a society under our Constitution. Instead, we say Google, Facebook, Twitter, each of you is your own republic of Google stan, Facebook stan. And in practice, if not in law, they are now making the decisions about the lines we draw. I want them to make those decisions. I was involved in the early decisions around Section 30 and protection from intermediaries. But I do see this shift where what the world sees, depends on what the deciders in Google think is a good idea. So I think we have to balance that. Obviously, I have two other concerns. I was worried about speaking more than 3 minutes, and I have two other concerns. One is the pretextual use of the tools that are created on these sites for things like hate speech and bad content. We know, and CDT along with the Berkman Center at Harvard did a study about account deactivation and content takedown in the context of human rights actors. And companies have to be extremely sophisticated and extremely vigilant not to find that the tools they're creating for bad speech and the notification processes don't in fact become tools of repressive countries and their phony civil society groups to suppress human rights activity. And they do, and they have, and the human rights actors find themselves far away from California, not understanding what the process is for them to get their content back up. So it's a double-edged sword. I think it's interesting that in our report, many of the recommendations are exactly the same as at Chris, but there is this other layer deep down about opportunities for appeal and human rights advisories to make sure that we've got some balance here. Because when you get out in the world, I think these companies may be unprepared and often demonstrate that they're not prepared really to think through a global lens. Finally, and here it is, I gave a blurb for this book, and I like this book, but the notion, the easy manner, Chris, that you and Abe Foxman throw anonymity under the bus is really very distressing. The impact on the call for real names as a norm just cannot be separated from political speech, and I don't think I have to sit here in a Washington audience and go back and have discussions about the Federalist Papers. But it's just not clear to me that anonymity is a conditioned precedent to hate speech. The case we've been using about this awful misogynist speech on Facebook is in a real names environment. So, somebody would have to show me something very different. It seems to me haters hate, and they're very happy to hate in public. The loss of anonymity is going to clearly chill speech, and I think, ironically, it's going to chill the counter speech that the book is rightly encouraging. It's not just political speech. I think it's telling that the reader comments that you included in the book almost entirely dealt with this issue. I liked, in particular, Daniel Citron, who we have both been working with us on this issue, arguing to turn that around with anonymity as a default that can be lost by harming others rather than the other way around. I thought that was a great suggestion. I'm maybe a bit less offended by the idea that you could adopt, the New York Times approach, which is you give some preference to registered users. But I think unpacking that recommendation a bit and the broader implications, and again, going back to the sort of human rights impact, I don't know that we could have, had tweets out of Tahrir Square or the revolution in Egypt if everything that came out of there had to, somehow be real names. So we can talk more about that. Having said all that, I think it's a great contribution. I think it will create interesting discussion, and I just decided I should do that rather than just doing an editorial. Adam?
Well, let me start by congratulating my friend Chris Wolf and Abe Foxman for this book. I know it's something Chris has been working on for quite a long time. Chris has been kind enough to invite me out on the road for a variety of events on this, ADL events and others, in New York and elsewhere, and here in town, doing our little dog and pony show back and forth. And I thought after all those exchanges we had over the last 5 years or so that I find a lot more to disagree with in this book. But I really didn't. I think this is a terrific contribution to the issue. In fact, it's, I think, going to be the definitive text in this field for some time to come. And you are to be congratulated on that. And you're to be specifically congratulated on the strong focus on sort of constructive solutions. Moving away from the sort of endless amount of time and amount of ink that is poured out trying to figure out legalistic solutions to this vexing problem, which I think ultimately just don't work, especially here in the United States. And specifically the focus on education, media literacy, digital citizenship, and most importantly, counter-speech. The counter-speech focus has always been my particular passion, like trying to find ways to encourage communities to speak out against things that are hateful or hurtful. And it goes back to the very old sort of standard in the world of free speech jurisprudence that the best response to bad speech is more and better speech. And that principle has infused countless of decisions, the Supreme Court and lower courts through the ages, specifically over the last 50 years, and really become, I think, the jurisprudential norm. So for better or worse, in a way, our standard in America is really kind of sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Whether that's true or not is sort of secondary to the fact that that is our approach under the law, that almost no words are verboten. And so you look at all the recent cases that we've had, and I cite many of them in my review of Chris's book that appears this week on the blog right for the Technology Liberation Front. There isn't a case I can name in the last quarter century, maybe even 50 years, where really, truly hateful, hurtful speech has been up for constitutional consideration and the restriction thereof, and the court has blessed any of that. So we have to find more constructive solutions. I think Chris and Abe's book is filled with them, and I applaud them for that focus. So just for the sake of argument, let me offer two nitpicks, one sort of about the general tone of the book, and the second about some specific solutions. In terms of the general tone, I'll echo something that Leslie built on, which is there are times in the book when Abe and Chris make their case with what I'll say is sort of a bit too much rhetorical flair. There's a problem we have broadly in online debates of all sorts, specifically debates about online speech, online content, child safety, which I call this sort of problem of proportionality, which is that we take a problem, a real problem, and we extrapolate from it that, oh, this is a crime, this is a crisis, it's across the whole internet. And it's certainly true that the internet makes vile, ugly, despicable things more visible, whether they be content or forms of communications. But that does not mean that they are the norm. It does not mean that the vast majority of online interaction, content, and commentary isn't of a beneficial, socially enriching nature. So it's important we put things in perspective here and not blow them out of complete proportion. Again, I want to make clear, online hate speech is a serious problem. The same way underage access to certain types of content is a problem. But I don't think it's an overwhelming crisis, and so I think it's important we get that right. Specifically, I was a bit turned off by one comment early in the book about, and Chris sort of reiterated up there, which is the claim that, quote, Hitler and the Nazis could have never dreamed of such an engine of hate such as the internet. And well, perhaps there's something to that, but it is also true that Hitler and the Nazis could have never, ever have dreamed of a platform of individual empowerment, transparency, and counter-speech like the internet. And I think it was precisely because in their day and age that we had a scarcity of communications platforms that we lacked the ability to speak out against the atrocities and the hateful things that they were perpetrating. And as I said in my review, you sort of just ask any Arab dictator today which era they'd rather live in, and when it would have been easier for them to control a platform for hate speech. I think most of them realize they're really in a hard place today when it comes to bottling up information about their tyrannical regimes. But let me get to the specific nitpicks I have about some of the proposals. I want to again stress that Chris and Abe have specifically not endorsed, for the most part, legalistic solutions and mandates to try to achieve sort of regulatory quick fixes or silver bullet fixes to these hard issues. Instead, for the most part, they rely very heavily, as Chris noted, on intermediaries. And I'm going to reiterate a few of the points that Leslie made in my concerns about this, because I think it's entirely sensible for intermediaries to do a certain amount of policing of the content and communications that flows over their networks, whether we're talking about social network providers or various other types of content hosting companies, so on and so forth. But there are a lot of tricky issues here. And specifically, Chris and Abe put a lot of focus on sort of voluntary de-anonymization and a move towards real name policies. It's not clear in the book if that's sort of partial and we're going to have experimentation, or if they want more comprehensive type of de-anonymization. But in a New York Times article that Chris wrote last year, he seemed to be pushing for most sites to adopt sort of the Facebook approach of real name policies. Well, it goes without saying, there are a lot of people who are uncomfortable with Facebook and real name policies. I happen to be one of them. I gave up on Facebook last year, and I really get peeved when people require me to log into their sites using Facebook, because I'm not going to do it. And it's not just because I don't belong to Facebook anymore. It's because I don't like the idea sometimes of always having to log in to leave a comment. And I think there are a lot of people who would appreciate sort of the anonymous exchange of vibrant viewpoints on some sites, but not others, and that our best bet here is sort of an ongoing dialogue and experimentation about this. And I think I really like something that I know Chris endorses, that the New York Times and other sites like Ars Technica does, which is premium placement of registered comments. So you don't have to necessarily register to leave a comment, but if you do, your content is more likely to be viewed because it'll be visible up higher in the queue, if you will. I think that's an interesting approach to this issue. There are other types of things you can do. A lot of sites and services online today already offer you the ability to just essentially disallow any sort of comments to be posted on your content. I know a lot of folks take advantage of this on content like video sites like YouTube and others because they just simply don't want to see the things that will come in about the comments on the video they put up of their kid or something. And people can say some really asinine, hurtful things on YouTube about, you name the topic. And so that's something that I think obviously more sites should be encouraged to do. The way I put it in my work on online safety and child protection is the way I'll put it here with regards to hate speech, which is we need diverse tools for a diverse citizenry. We need a lot of different approaches. Not any one single approach is going to work here. And of course, the most important approach we need is one that encourages community interaction and counter speech. And Chris's book really nails it on that front. And I want to again endorse his vision in that regard. I will say, however, that Leslie's right. I think there's this question about the more we ask intermediaries to do, the more people will accuse them of essentially engaging in the same form of censorship that we've accused governments of engaging in. Now, where I differ with some of my friends like Leslie and Rebecca and others on this is that I don't view these intermediaries as nation states. Last time I checked, they do not have standing armies and the ability to imprison any of us. And therefore, if they want to take sweeping steps to restrict certain types of speech, guess what? We don't have to use them. We have the power of escape. An escape I have from Facebook and the digital nudist colony that it is. I'm just not a big fan of that particular online community. So we have those choices, and we can choose, and I would hope, and I have faith, that people will flock to the more socially enriching sites that have better terms of service and the online policies about acceptable use, and who give the community more chances to flag inappropriate content and then respond to it. I think that's always going to be the most constructive way forward. But legally speaking, if we do encourage intermediaries to do more and more and more, it's eventually going to force these discussions about what kind of regulation we should have to guide that process. And specifically, it's going to reopen Section 230. I think that's where we stand today with what the AGs are doing. For those of you who aren't aware, and Chris briefly mentioned it, the AGs have for many years been on the warpath against Section 230, which we should, I guess, explain for those who are not aware. Essentially immunizes online intermediaries from liability for the content communication that flows over their networks that they do not have any control over. Is that a good one-liner explanation? And for many of this, Section 230 has been in fact, I wrote a Forbes column 2 years ago on its 15th anniversary, calling it the greatest of all internet laws. It has been essential to facilitating online speech and commerce. And many of the greatest sites that we all enjoy would maybe not even exist without Section 230. In fact, they probably couldn't exist in many foreign countries who have more restrictive policies. So, just getting back to Chris's proposals, I think they're fine in good measure. I wonder what that measure is, if it should be comprehensive, and maybe this is the way to turn it back to Chris to get a discussion going, which is, should everybody be like Facebook? Should everybody be forced to reveal? And I guess it gets to the question of, do we need an identity layer for the internet? Which is a discussion we've been having for 15 years, right? I mean, there's a lot of people who've always said we need more ways to credential online, to make it easier for people to reveal who they are, or maybe force them to reveal who they are. And I've always been a little bit uncomfortable with that, although identification and credentialing absolutely has its place in certain contexts. There are some sites I would never visit without revealing myself and expecting everybody else to reveal themselves. There are others where I'd never reveal myself. So, turning it back to you, Chris, what's the right balance there?
I just want to add a few more comments to pile on Chris, and then we'll open it up to respond. I actually, as I said before, I really enjoyed this book, especially because I think of the approach of advocating shared responsibility among those in the internet ecosystem, both internet stakeholders and internet users. I think this is actually an approach that's useful not only for hate speech, but in many other areas where it's more useful than heavy-handed legislation or regulation. I think my main criticism of the book is I think how it treats the internet a bit as a monolith, And I wonder if it's too much of a simplification to talk about online hate speech overall sometimes, instead of talking about hate speech in specific context. So for example, you're more likely to encounter hate speech in anonymous comments on a blog than you are to receive as a text message on your cell phone or a fax if you still receive fax. And my point here is that the hate speech is probably a consequence of technology, or that maybe it's not an inevitable consequence of technology. It seems to be a bigger problem on certain platforms, especially user-generated content sites where maybe you have anonymous speech, maybe standalone sites. That's where many of the examples were in your book. Much more so than the rest of the internet. And I just think that means maybe we should, if we recognize that, we should focus more on how we design systems and technologies. I also want to, I saw a little bit of a parallel because in the privacy community, you hear a lot of talk lately about privacy-related design. It's a term I really dislike, actually, because I think it's not that there's not values embedded in technology, but I think it overemphasizes privacy at the expense of other values. For example, we want security by design. We want green technology by design. We want energy efficient by design. And in this case, I think we're actually, I think it's great to have something like civility by design. But I think, in some cases, these goals might be antithetical to one another. And I think we have to think about where there are these challenges. And the last point, this was made a little bit by Leslie, so I don't want to spend much time on it, but I do think that reading through your recommendations, I understand that you're saying that you are not advocating legal solutions. But at the same time, I was left with the impression that you weren't advocating for government involvement. And I would say that there should really be active engagement on these issues by policymakers. In fact, I would like many of them to read your book. And I would just say that even if it's not a solution that's done through law, as we've seen even in the privacy space, having government lead in areas and lower barriers to doing things well for technologists is, I think, something that's very useful. So I'll end it there, and I think we've raised a lot of points that you probably want to respond to.
You have, and I just want to thank you for the thoughtful discussion, and I can celebrate the fact that the book did exactly what we wanted it to do, which is promote some really intelligent thinking and useful thinking about very complicated issues. One of the things I hope we didn't do is say these are the only answers and this is the prescription to follow, and I think your conversation really demonstrated that. And since Abe's not here, I can say all the things you disagreed with, he wrote. I'm just kidding, obviously. On his blueberry. So I do want to talk about a few things, and then I'd love to hear what the folks here and online are thinking about it. We debated whether to put that whole anonymity thing in the book, and I don't think we go out there quite as far as either of you suggest. We do think it's something to think about, and think about ways like the New York Times approach. And since the book was written, there was an episode that I think kind of proves our point, although it's at Facebook. I'm sorry, Adam. But they do allow anonymous pages at Facebook. And there was a site that had a meme about Anne Frank, that famous picture of Anne Frank, but the caption was, "What's that I'm smelling? Oh, it's my parents in the oven." And Facebook decided that was not speech that violated their terms of service. We probably could have had an interesting debate about that, but they still thought it wasn't something that ought to be there. So they went to the administrator of the pages, who were unknown to the public, were not visible, and said, look, we're inclined to take this off unless you're willing to stand behind it and be identified with it, and then engage with people on why you think that's an appropriate humor. By the way, Facebook's position on that, I think, was it's humor and therefore it's in bounds, which was their position on the misogynistic conduct too. And just by saying something is humor doesn't strip it of its hateful nature. So there was an instance in which they gave the individual a choice. You can remain anonymous, or we're going to take it down, or you can step up to the line and take responsibility. That's one experiment with anonymity to use, and there are others. If we didn't do it enough, then I apologize, but we really tried to emphasize the importance of anonymity to free speech, and we understand the Arab Spring and all of that was promoted by the fact that you can't be traced and can't be identified. So we certainly do understand the problems with a total ban on anonymity. And I just want to Well, two things. One, I want to say we do see there's a role of the government, and I've met with the Department of Education. I'm meeting with the State Department folks on internet freedom. We think these are all issues that can be discussed and solutions fostered by the government. Our government participates a lot in the OSCE, which interestingly is meeting in Istanbul soon. And they have focuses on internet hate in particular, so our government's contributing to that. But I think the Department of Education ought to promote cyber literacy in a way that they don't do now, and talk about how people can engage in counter speech. And so the last thing I would say about either you can call them sovereigns in cyberspace or simply companies that you can choose to do business with, we do think there needs to be transparency about what they're doing in this area. That's why we've convened a working group that has so many of them at the table with us, and we're trying to put together codes of conduct that's worked out through a multi-stakeholder process so that people can agree on what the terms of service mean. And so that there's a vehicle to complain when some speech is taken down that you think ought to remain up. And when other speech isn't taken down, there ought to be a vehicle. And it shouldn't be a Google solution or a Facebook solution or a Microsoft solution. It really ought to be a solution that the internet community participates in as a whole. And that's what we hope will be the impact of this book. So thank you again for the opportunity to be here and talk about it.
Thanks. And I want to open it up a little bit for a discussion between everyone here before we open up for questions about, I think particularly on the issue of identity, because that's something that I think everyone raised, and we had a little bit of response there. I just want to open up another point on that before everyone responds. And that's the issue of two things. One, getting back to what Facebook has proposed about if people are basically flagging something as hate speech or as inappropriate to community guidelines, making somebody stand behind it with their identity. In the past, they've also, for celebrities, actually verified identities very closely, because right now you are required to identify yourself on Facebook. They estimate about 8% of people are doing this falsely. So you can go a step further and actually tie it to a physical government identity. That would be another step. But I also want to bring it to this other issue that's come up in the past, which was the case of Lori Drew, who had a MySpace account that she created fictitiously. She used it to bully a 13-year-old online who later committed suicide. Justice Department took action against her under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act because it was a violation of the terms of service. And obviously there's been a lot of discussion about updating CFAA, and this gets to, though, if you have intermediaries who are policing this, basically, and saying that they're requiring identification of individuals, how do they do that if we update CFAA so that they cannot actually go after violators in terms of service? Or how do you balance that? Because that is a legal question. So why don't I start over there and we'll work back. So Chris, you can...
Leslie, you look like you're itching to answer that one first.
No, I'm not itching to answer. I'm not sure I completely understand the question. So
well,
maybe your answer will give me mine.
The CFAA is a crude mechanism to utilize in solving these complex social problems, and I'd far prefer that we have ongoing experimentation with terms of service, acceptable use policies, and things like this. Now, there is a legitimate question about what constitutes harassment and how we go about policing it, right? That this is something that Chris mentions in his book, that we do have some laws that are on the books, and we do have stalking laws and direct enticement to violence laws and actual violence restrictions. You can't be violent against somebody. And then we do have harassment. But it is a tricky area when the harassment is purely speech. And that's the fundamental tension we face here. What Lori Drew did, that whole situation is awful. I do not think the computer fraud and abuse kind of approach is the right way to get about it. Honestly, I don't really have the right answer. I was very concerned, however, by some of the answers that some state officials and AGs were coming up with after that case, because it played into a broader debate that we were having in this country between 2005 and 2007, when the AGs sort of became aware of MySpace and how many kids were on it, and there was a big push for some sort of online authentication of identity. And then came that case and said, oh boy, then we've even got bigger problems. Again, I just don't think there's a technical fix here, whether it be through, CFAA or even identification laws that are going to work very effectively. I just don't think that will solve most of these problems. So I guess that's all I got to say on that. I know it's not an answer. It's to say that it's more complicated than those laws allow for.
Well, I think I agree, and I can't imagine updating CFAA so that everybody who might violate a term of service is potentially a federal criminal. So, I mean, I just think that's a non-starter. I share Adam's. I'm perplexed about what to do about harassment. I haven't seen a harassment statute written that probably is really constitutional. But we certainly, and obviously when that harassment has to do with schools and bullying, there are other strings that can be pulled that are not necessarily legal strings. I do think a lot of that goes back to communities taking some responsibility. And I don't think identity necessarily answers that question. I mean, I think identity is a piece in the toolbox that needs to be applied in the internet context where it's appropriate to do so. I mean, we don't go onto our bank without some kind of authentication of who we are. And depending on the kinds of things that migrate onto the internet, there may be more of those places where it's appropriate. I think what I worry about in a sort of Facebook type context is that we're sort of advocating for identity if you kind of look at how the government thinks about identity, when is identity necessary, and levels going through highest level of security. The one that should be the most open is when just people are talking with each other and there's no, secret information or danger of theft of financial resources. It seems to me that if we start by putting that sort of fairly significant level of authentication into sort of what I would say is the piece of the internet, the pure speech layer, I'm not quite sure where we go to when we start looking at the places where identity is really important. I will say, I continue to believe, and I appreciate your point about these people disappearing rather than giving their identity. I can tell you that everywhere I blog as a woman, because I am blogging on issues that have to do with technology, that the comments are the most misogynistic, outrageous kinds of things that if I had taken the same blog and handed it to one of my colleagues would never happen. So, so who is that coming from? That's coming from people who think about the internet.
And that kind of gets to...
I'd love to solve this problem. I'm completely shocked that it doesn't affect me. It's not keeping me from speaking.
Well, I was going to make the point that I do think that while really virulent hate speech is restricted to certain precincts in the internet,
Right.
It's having an impact. And I think the isolation of electronic communications by itself has an impact. I kind of joke about the emails and the tone of emails I get from my own partners and colleagues in a law firm. There's something about email that is not a very warm and fuzzy mode of communication.
It's an absence of context or emotion. But
Exactly. and sort of like being in a car, you feel like you're in a cocoon and you don't have responsibility. And I think that promotes some of the intolerance.
But I can't say, but I also think there's a difference between intolerance and hate speech.
No, I do, but I do too. And I wanted to talk about the Lori Drew thing for a moment. I said at the time, I went on NewsHour and said it's ridiculous overextension of the CFAA. If there wasn't a law to cover what she did in the locality
Right.
Where she was, there wasn't a law to cover it.
I'm not sure that was hate speech. It was
Impersonation. And so one of the things to do is to train the Megan Myers, the little girl who committed suicide, what to do when they encounter that kind of online harassment or bullying or unhappiness. And there's a lot of resources, and Adam's involved with it, dealing with that.
I want to ask two more questions to the panel, and then we'll open it up. Because I think we've kind of touched on a few of these. So one is community-based policing, which is something, I think this is one where there has been full agreement across the board. So I think what's interesting with that is, I think there's, if you have something that's explicitly racist or homophobic today, especially in the United States, these groups are more mainstream, and that type of those type of comments will be flagged. But I think other groups are less mainstream. Even I think groups like Scientology, there is less tolerance for. And so, the question is really, how do we have effective community-based policing for smaller, less organized minority groups? And I'll start with you, Chris.
So it depends on what you mean by policing. If you mean,
people
commenting on the content and saying that's not cool, that's not right.
As you propose it in your book as a form of counter speech, as an effective antidote to this issue, do you see it as effective for small groups?
I do, as long as the people who are making decisions about what appears are informed about the rights of small minority groups. And I think at Facebook and Google they are. They have staffs that are sensitive to that. There are report abuse flags on a lot of sites, and people just reflexively, if they disagree with something, are reporting abuse. And so I think the vast majority of those reports are of that sort, and they're discounted as a result.
But it's not just that a lot of the sites, they view the flagging of offensive content as essentially them saying that they found it offensively stupid, right? Like, I think this video, this celebrity, I just think it's so terrible.
Yeah.
Not hateful or offensive.
Amazon was that review helpful?
Right.
Right. And that was my only option. By the way, the first 3 reviews of the book were hate speech.
Crazy. Some of them were a little crazy.
They were pretty.
But my only option was to report it as helpful or unhelpful.
Right.
So
probably helpful than sales of the book.
Well, you can comment on that.
yes.
That's comment, right?
Yes.
So you can say, obviously, this person did not read it.
I did write that I'm not saying
Right.
not the word.
Right.
So Daniel, my concern is less about does the Scientology group in the United States know how to defend itself in those conversations than the point I made at the beginning, which is that we have a global internet and that we're having a U.S. conversation among people who have U.S. values, who are used to asserting themselves, engaging in counter speech without fear of repercussion, mostly unworried that there will be, campaigns of abuse flagging to take down our speech. So, there are certain parts of sort of the U.S. value of free expression that I do feel like have to become more of an internet norm before we can really say they're going to be effective, or else what we're really doing is having a bunch of Americans decide what's offensive and not offensive, and and that's a problem. Equally a problem is when these companies start getting notices of what's offensive that doesn't line up with what these companies think, and I think that they're feeling that more and more. I mean, if you can't have a discussion about religion, and in many parts of the world you can't, then this notion of flagging and counter speech is not terribly helpful. And yet people are coming into these venues without this sort of, we're all First Amendment advocates and lawyers are sort of drenched in this stuff, and people who grow up in the United States are kind of heavily dipped in it as well. But I do worry that some of these remedies could be turned around in very unpleasant ways in large parts of the world, and it's not our internet anymore. Notwithstanding the NSA revelations, it's not our internet anymore.
So, just a brief comment on that point. I don't think there's any avoiding what others would refer to as the problem of American exceptionalism with regards to internet platforms and policies. We were the leaders in developing internet platforms, and we are leaders in terms of the companies that have fostered its growth, and therefore those policies will come to play out across the world. Now, of course, we might be heading for a world of what some have called sort of the world of splinter nets.
Well, that's what I'm worried
where
about.
we have a highly... I'm worried about it in one sense because I love a globally interconnected network of networks.
Right.
On the other hand, I don't want to see America put in a position where we would have to essentially negotiate the First Amendment country by country and essentially come up with sort of safe harboring of certain types of speech. I prefer to keep sort of our version of the internet and a little bit of American exceptionalism alive and well.
So the Benghazi example we cite in the book and how Google handled that, I think, is an example.
Right.
They felt they needed to take it down in the Middle East, but they didn't take it down here, even with pressure from the White House.
Right.
And that's if you go back, mentioned the Global Network Initiative principles for companies. I mean, that is how they are, the recommendation for navigation is you have people on the ground, you've got all kinds of reasons that you can't just tell a country to go away. You might have to take that content down, but that doesn't mean you have to take it down for the world. And,
Yeah.
Right.
so I agree with you. I'm just worried that center will not hold because there will be more and more people and more assets and possibly servers in other countries, and that we're going to be forced to confront. I mean, the companies are confronting it every day, but they're not necessarily confronting it with people on the ground.
Right. I would just say that with regards to, generally speaking, freedom of speech and the First Amendment, even before the internet, we've never taken a position that this was like something that was negotiable as part of like a free trade agreement, right? We just kind of said, no, boo-boo. I mean, we've thumbed our noses at the rest of the world with regards to the First Amendment. I think that's a good thing.
Well,
I think, especially here, because a good part of what the rest of the world considers hate speech is stuff that we would believe is religious expression. I mean, you look at things that happen in Turkey and other countries.
Right.
I mean, a lot of the Arab communities, I mean, it's just taken for granted. We allow that here, right? And people can say some fairly offensive things about each other's religions in this country, but the reality is the rest of the world, that is absolutely illegal. And
most of the rest of the world. I'm not disagreeing with you about what standard I'd like to apply. I'm just saying that I worry that our ability to, be in Fortress America and just take those positions, whether it's the splinter net problem, the server problem, or the fact that these companies are getting big and having your server in Mountain View is not necessarily the answer.
So these are not academic issues. A French court responding to a complaint about anti-Semitic tweets has ordered Twitter, which doesn't have a presence in France, to unmask the identity of the people who uttered those tweets. And they could be American citizens entitled to anonymity.
That's right.
They could be French citizens who were violating French law. And instead of getting an order from court and perfecting it in state court in California, which is what you should do in international law, and having the First Amendment issues debated, they just ordered Twitter. Now,
but it happens every day. This is just a visible one.
This is very visible. Although, in Great Britain recently, they did perfect the order, and Twitter turned over the identities of the tweeters without much of a fight, as I understand it.
Let me raise another issue, and this touches on, I think, what Leslie's talking about, the kind of international aspects here. One, Gary, actually, Chris, so you were talking on a panel yesterday with European privacy regulators, and one big European privacy issue is this right to be forgotten. And I see that as very much in contrast with some of the goals of combating hate speech, because it seems like one of the, if you can delete speech that you've made in the past, that minimizes the consequence of having to live with those repercussions. And I think those repercussions, may have may be a useful deterrent. And the U.S. is certainly interested in migrating some of those policies over here.
Yeah. So
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you do when you have these conflicting values.
So it's interesting. You remind me of the movie Defending Your Life with Meryl Streep and Albert Brooks. They're waiting to learn whether they get into heaven, and they're going to review the videotape of their life. And Meryl Streep's fine with it, of course. But Albert Brooks said, "Oh my God, you have a videotape of my life? All those horrible things I did as a youth, or when I was drunk, or whatever." Look, we do have a right to a clean start, a fresh start, which the internet really complicates a lot. And so I do believe in a limited right to be forgotten. If you posted something to the internet, to Facebook that you don't like, you should take it down. When Adam closes his account, that should be down forever, or at least under his control, right? And if you're a notorious hater, people are going to remember that, whether you've taken it down or not. And if it's simply an indiscretion, look at Prince Harry. He sort of recovered from wearing a Nazi uniform as a joke at a party, didn't he? Because he wasn't really a hater. He was just stupid and careless.
I have to disagree a little bit, Chris, because first of all, I'm not sure we have a right even partially to be forgotten. I think history is history, and when we talk about efforts to essentially censor it, I think there's a question about how far the law can go to do so. If I'm part of a community or a platform where vibrant exchange is taking place, and I happen to utter some things that are very, very hurtful or hateful in that exchange, I don't think I want, if other people did this, I wouldn't want them to be able to say, let's delete that entire bulletin board full of content, right?
So Congress does that every day. You get to revise your comments in the congressional record.
But at least we have other records of what they said. They can't go to C-SPAN and say, delete your tapes.
Right.
They couldn't go to the Washington Post.
I'm not proposing that.
Right.
To the extent I believe in the right to be forgotten, it's extremely...
Okay, yeah, but I can't understand Dan's question, because there is this question, there's sort of reputational rights are butting up against the sort of debate about hate speech and the long memory of the internet, that problem. Because it is real in a world where search can retrieve anything said. I'm still astonished by things I find that I said 15 years ago online somehow, or it's usually 4 or 5 pages deep into my search results, but it's there, damn it, and I wish I could have some of it. But the reality is that it was part of history, it's part of exchanges that we had and dialogues, and luckily none of my comments were hateful, they were just harebrained. Bad ideas that I might have had in youth that I've long since realized were crazy.
Yeah.
But I don't necessarily think there's an easy solution to this. We can encourage people to sort of clean up after themselves and be careful about what they say to begin with. One of the most innovative things I saw one school community do in New York, school district do in New York, is they had a data delete day where they encouraged youngsters to come to the cafeteria and bring their electronic devices, computers or phones or whatever, and actually think about what they could delete that they had posted online that wasn't sensible, either about themselves, or about others. Now, of course, it was already out there. But again, this is part of digital citizenship and literacy, right? It's media literacy. It's about thinking about the consequences of your actions. And I don't know how effective that was, but it's one of those teaching moment kind of things, right? And so part of what I hate about ideas like right to be forgotten is that it pretends there's like a quick fix to our youthful indiscretions or silly moments, even as adults. Sometimes you have to bear the consequences of your actions and learn from them. And that includes when you say hateful or hurtful things online.
As Paula Dean is finding out.
That's a good example, I guess.
Yeah, I guess, I fall, I think, a little bit closer to Chris. It seems to me that stuff you put online under your name on a social media site that you've made affirmative decisions to share with some but not all people, you ought to be able to delete. I just think you don't have an expectation that somebody else who cited you or shared, or you've become part of somebody else's article, there should be no expectation that you actually get to be forgotten. And yesterday there was actually a opinion, I suppose apparently the way the Human Rights Court operates in Europe is first there's kind of a opinion by
Advocate General.
And the Advocate General really came to that conclusion. There are a lot of other interesting conclusions that I think Western companies need to take note of, which is the laws apply if you provide the service there, even if you don't happen to be on the ground. But I think they got that right, even under European law, where there's a much stronger both reputational and data privacy rights. But these are the challenges now as compared to what we all did 10 years ago are much more complicated, and they very often have to do with clash of rights.
I'd like to open it up for questions. Please.
Just to comment, Adam, in the Internet governance discussion at Brookings on Friday, the general emerging consensus is that the Internet will become a network of national networks because of the legal and concerns on it. So that brings then a practical question. That
I'm sorry, can you just identify yourself?
I'm sorry?
Can you just identify yourself?
Oh, Jim Farmer.
We're not doing anonymity here.
Real name policy.
I knew someone was going to ask for the source, right? Leslie, you talked about international. I'm going to give you a practical question. How should the U.S. respond to the posting of the Al-Qaeda monthly journal? Should we not permit that IP address to be accessible by the U.S.? Should we ask an ISP to be responsible for determining whether that's hate speech or not? What should our response be to that?
I think that the existence of the ability for the government to read and other researchers to read what the Al-Qaeda Monthly Journal is saying is an advantage of transparency in the internet that would not have been available otherwise. I don't think there's anything in our Constitution that allows the government to order anybody to take it down, except insofar as if it meets our incitement standard.
Isn't there a promotion of terrorism law that, for example, Almanar television is not allowed to be broadcast in the United States?
Right.
Wouldn't that be covered by that?
I think he's asking the sort of normative question if we think that's a good idea,
Yeah.
right? Personally, I'm with Leslie, and I don't. I think I'm also concerned that some members of Congress have taken it upon themselves to essentially just pick up the phone and tell certain companies, like, we think you should not post certain things, and Senator Lieberman did that with regards to WikiLeaks content, right?
Yeah. He then called me and said, is there a way to amend Section 230? And I told him no.
Yeah.
Good for you. So I would have told him something else, but no, something nasty. But I think that this is a hard question. I don't think it rises to incitement to violence because it's sort of political speech from terrorist groups abroad, and I think there are other standards you can apply here. But I could make the normative case that we ought to see what they're saying, and we ought to be able to respond to it. And I would say that about almost just about anything, I mean, including extremely violent videos that we see from overseas, from some of these hate groups and others. And that this puts my First Amendment, beliefs to the test at times, because I've had people push a lot harder than this and say something, well, what about videos of like beheadings and stuff like this? I mean, this is reality, this is the world, this is what terrorists do, and we ought to be able to respond to it. I mean, it's an awful thing to think about what's in some of that content that they do put on those sites.
Well, in the wake of the Boston Marathon bombing, people pointed out that the bombers got their recipes online.
Yeah. And, I'm sure they would have found other ways to get that content one way or another. I mean, it's out there. But it's hard to place restriction on bomb-making, recipes. I had a friend I used to work with whose mom was an author, and she did a lot of researching online for her fictional books, including things about, like, how to make bombs. She got some interesting calls and visits.
Yeah. I do think, it's not a position that I necessarily endorse, but I do think that there has been some thoughtful debate and scholarship about what incitement means online, and whether incitement, as we conceptualized it a long time ago, that test and standard makes sense in the internet world. I don't see an easy way to be able to figure out how you look at incitement when it isn't a bunch of people standing in front of you in Klan outfits and you're saying, go do this. Right. But you have to acknowledge that this has become very, very it's become very
complicated.
Well,
look at Innocence of Muslims video, right, on YouTube.
But that's more of a heckler's veto. I mean, there's the incitement, literally, of the Al-Qaeda video, and at what point are they inciting under, that meets our legal test. And then there's just the incitement that happens because people don't like what you say, and I'm
Let's take a few more
less
questions.
concerned about that.
I think there's, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Moshe Klein, Homeland Security Policy Institute. Just think, something we were thinking about, we said that the web, these companies aren't nations, and essentially they're businesses. So when business run by incentive, like what's going to get them the most money, and how it, like, and they're not necessarily thinking about what's their societal responsibility. So how do we incentivize the censoring or filtering or the policing of their own sites? How do we make that cost on a cost-benefit analysis helpful for them?
I think we already have. I mean, we have under U.S. law because we've enacted a bargain, and that bargain is, on the one hand, you are not going to be liable for all this content. And this was, before millions of pages. I mean, I think it was.
But you can take it down.
But we're also not going to be liable for taking it down. So we've created this two-side protection that I think has worked fairly well. I also, they may be businesses, but under to go back into international human rights jurisprudence, They don't have the same obligations as countries in terms of human rights protection, but they do have obligations. And this is, I think, a growing conversation among companies and civil society.
And I think there's a congruity between promoting important social values and succeeding in business. You know, if Google and Facebook become places that really go against their users' interests because of their speech policies, they're not going to be very successful as a business matter.
But having said that, on the business side, everybody, would like to have real names registration because it just continues to further the business model, right? We now can,
Google Plus dropped that, didn't they?
Well, it's strongly encouraged, but it doesn't matter because wherever I am, whether it's Google or Facebook or whether I have logged out or done all the things I try to encourage other people to do and gotten rid of my third-party cookies, they know everything. And so, the business model is in tension also with some of the things we'd like them to do. That's another whole day.
And one other brief point, just on the premise of your question about how we get companies to do socially responsible things, goes back to the complication of, do we all agree on what social responsibility means? And so in this context, when it comes to offensive online speech, I think the answer is we're not necessarily always in agreement. We don't have clear definitions because of the same eye of the beholder problems we have about all offensive speech and content, including hate speech. And I'll just mention what Chris already mentioned. If you don't believe me, go read that recent Jeff Rosen piece in the Atlantic. It was called the Delete Squad: Google, Twitter, Facebook, and the new global battle over future of free speech. Basically, and there was another, again, a Morozov piece in the New York Times called "You Can't Say That on the Internet," which accused Silicon Valley of being too prudish and conservative, and basically saying they already censor and block too much, that they're trying to be our nannies. So, we can't even get consensus among a lot of intellectuals about what the right approach is on this. Again, this is why I would always argue that we need a diversity of approaches, and that social responsibility is ultimately something that's more of an organic thing that develops from the bottom up.
And thank goodness we're having a discussion about it, and
right.
We appreciate the opportunity to do that here.
Let's do a couple more questions, kind of rapid fire. I want to go back, since everybody else, go ahead.
Sarah Freeman, Communications Daily. I wanted to know, you talked a lot about intermediaries like Facebook and Google, but I was interested to learn about ISPs. Do you interact with them at all in terms of monitoring?
Mostly not because of their fear of the deep packet inspection bugaboo, that they really like to be the dumb pipes, except on sites where they're curating and responsible for the content, but in terms of the flow of traffic, they typically keep hands off. With that said, we've got some of the ISPs sitting at the table because they have portals and places where they act as social media companies or content hosts and not just dumb pipes. I will point out that Network Solutions chose not to host a website by ultra-right-wing Dutch parliamentarian Girders or something. Yeah. He had this film called Fitna, which is a virulently anti-Muslim film, and they chose not to host that. But ISPs typically are not involved in this discussion, nor do I think they should be. But some universities were acting as ISPs, have chosen to block sites like Juicy Campus and other sites that promote the posting of things like revenge porn or rumors about women and so forth. So that's one way that the operator of the network has acted to stop the flow of hate speech.
Just a quick adding to that, ISPs stand in a different position in the internet than the online application software layer. I mean, they have the potential not only to view everything, but to be gatekeepers, real gatekeepers, not gatekeepers that you can pick up and walk. You don't like Facebook, you go to some. And so I think both their obligations are different, their First Amendment interests I think are different, but the impact of their doing active filtering would be different.
And their desire to avoid really seriously
and
regulating
I don't think
neutrality.
they really want to do that. I don't think they really want to do that.
Every panel in DC comes back from that.
No.
I
Just
real quick. I love this phrase, civility by design, and I'd like to explore a little bit more of how we can make this system
We
work
have
better.
to ask Ann Kabukian if we can use it, but I like
Some people think that term was used before and.
There was security by design long before there was privacy by design.
Yeah.
But in the old design of email and a lot of social media, the rule is don't feed the trolls. Don't respond.
Yeah.
Because 5 or 10 times as many people are going to see your response as what you were reacting to. And we also have this problem that if I respond to a troll, I might now be the victim of their fury. Can we think about ways to design a system so that we're targeting the counter speech? We're not actually amplifying the original hate speech? And is there any way to maybe think about giving us semi-anonymity when we respond, so that I don't have to put my name out there, but maybe I affiliate with a group. Maybe I say I'm a registered member of the ADL, and I think...
Or report what you're concerned about to the ADL, because we have a full-time staff. It's a pretty miserable job, because they spend 24 hours a day, as I like to put it, because it's the ADL, 24/6, they're on duty. Reviewing this stuff and responding. So they take complaints and then they'll respond, and you're removed from the equation.
But even that, when ADL responds, twice as many people, 10 times as many people see it.
We're used to it.
Yeah, I think it's a big problem. I think, my own experience where I've had to make a decision about, as a woman, do I want to get into this flame war with a bunch of crazy guys? And so counter speech is nice, but I don't find myself engaging in it in those kinds of forums. I might engage in it in a serious intellectual forum with my colleagues here, but I don't know how you do that. But again, I think I said that I think the real names really possibly undermines the counter speech for those who have less power in this situation. I think the counter speech by third parties when the hate is aimed at an individual is a particularly important thing. I mean, sort of this inchoate hate, I don't like it, it's awful, but what concerns me most is the amount of stuff that gets aimed at a person. And very much it can be a person who wrote a book or, and very often it's women. And I think that's where communities standing up is particularly important. That they shouldn't have to defend themselves with counter speech. That's kind of the digital citizenship aspect to this that I think is so important.
Chris, we have 30 seconds, so I'll just give you the last word if you have anything else to say.
I really don't, except to say that I think we explored a lot of the complicated issues surrounding this, and as I said, the book did exactly what we hoped it would do, is promote more discussion and attention to this issue, which has been kind of ignored over the years, and hope that will continue, and especially thank you and ITIF for hosting us here today. And I have to mention again, the books are for sale in the back, and all the proceeds on my end go to the ADL to continue our work.
Well, thank you for being here, and thanks to our panelists for the discussion.
Thank you.